First,
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with a steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
the Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President.
I received a message from Her Excellency dated 27th of April 2023. It reads as follows. Dear Mr. President, I shall be away from the island on duty leave during the period 2nd to 11th May 2023. In accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the office of the President during my absence. As the Honourable of the Senate will not meet prior to my departure, it will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you therefore please bring my absence formally to the attention of the Honourable of the Senate when next it meets? Yours faithfully, signed by Her Excellency the President of Barbados.
Announcements by Your Honour.
Announcements. Where's the page? I have received indications of absence from a number of senators. Just trying to find my page. I think. Yeah. Here we go. Apologies for absence from Senators Nurse, Senator Tate, Senator Driggs. Our chaplain also asked to be excused. He's absent today. Indications of late arrival from Her Honour Senator Thompson, Senator Maynard, and Senator Reverend Cameron Dr. Rogers. The minutes of our meeting Friday, March 31st, 2023 to be deferred.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting of the Senate held on March 31st, Friday, be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting of Friday, March 31st, 2023 be deferred. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Willing, say ayes have it. Those minutes stand deferred. In terms of further announcements, the Honourable Senate would join me, I'm sure, in congratulating and taking note of the professional advancement of one of our own. Senator Rogers has been elevated to the office of canon in the Anglican Church and will henceforth therefore be Senator, the Reverend Canon Dr. John Rogers. We congratulate him. We congratulate him on his preferment, and as usual, Senator Rogers is at this time winding down the, I believe, 10 o'clock Mass at St. George Parish Church, and will be with us shortly, but I thought it important that we enter into the record our rejoicing with him as he advances in the important ministry of the priesthood. And we wish him all the best, and of course, our continued prayer and support. I also understand it's the birthday of one of our own today, Senator King, and I know that he's chosen to celebrate his day in service to the people of Barbados. We thank you for your commitment to Judy, Senator King. I don't know if that deserves a song or not.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I am commanded to lay the following documents. It is quite a lengthy list, so please bear with me. The following documents as listed are Caves of Barbados Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the year ended March 31st, 2021, Loan Contract 5728/OC-BA BAL1053, Skills for the Future 2. This is digital transformation for inclusive and quality education between the government of Barbados and the Inter-American Development Bank. Annual reports and audited financial statements of the Barbados National Oil Company for the years ending to March 31st, 2017 through 2020, also up to March 31st, 2021 and 2022. The audited financial statement of accounts for the Board of Management of the Lodge School for the year ending March 2021, the audited financial statements and annual report of the Barbados Tourism Authority for the 17-month period ended August 31st, 2014, annual reports and audited financial statements of the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc. for the years 2015 through to 2020, and the Declaration of Mission Barbados.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Willing, say ayes have it. Standing Order 45-2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the Barbados Optional Savings Bond offered to the Public Amendment Bill and to move the first reading of said bill.
The question is that the Barbados Optional Savings Bonds offered to the Public Amendment Bill 2023 be read a first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the first reading of the Transport Authority Amendment Bill of 2023.
The question is that the Transport Authority Amendment Bill 2023 be read the first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, sir.
Order
In the name
number
of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passage of a resolution to amend the standing orders of the Senate for the purpose of establishing 3 joint select standing committees.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. The order at order number 4, item number 4, is actually to be amended, and I wish to amend it at this time to read as follows. It would read to move the passing of a resolution to refer to the Standing Orders Committee of the Senate a proposal for the establishment of 3 joint select standing committees. Now, the proposal for the establishment of these 3 committees was circulated and appended to the order paper circulated to all senators, and as such, it is now proposed that this matter be referred to the Standing Orders Committee as constituted.
The question is that the proposal to amend the standing orders to establish 3 joint select committees be referred to the Standing Orders Committee, and that is, of course, in reference to Standing Orders 72, where the Standing Orders Committee will consider such matter, and a report of the Standing Orders Committee becomes then the subject of the debate on the substance of the matter. At this stage, the matter is referred to the Standing Orders Committee without debate on the substance. That will come, then the Standing Orders Committee makes its recommendation to the Senate as a whole. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This matter is therefore referred to the Standing Orders Committee of the Honourable Senate.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Transport Authority Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I too, even though he is not with us just yet, and perhaps later on during the course of today's presentation, I will join you in extending the congratulations on behalf of the government of Barbados to our own Reverend Dr. Rogers. Certainly, I think those of us who were in the last Senate would recall we celebrated his elevation to the role of doctor when he achieved his PhD from in this place, and now we are again celebrating yet another achievement, and that is his elevation to canon. And I am certain that although many of us remember when he joined us in the Senate and we affectionately call him New Rev, even though several years later he is no longer new, I think he keeps reinventing himself and keeps ensuring that the public of Barbados and certainly the Anglican diocese recognize what an absolute gem they have in the person of our new canon, Reverend Dr. John Rogers. And we would wish to extend our absolute congratulations to him. Both in his professional capacity and as a person, he is an excellent human being. And I am honored to share space in this honorable Senate with him. So, Mr. President, we are here this morning and presenting to you a matter that has been debated extensively in the public space and in the other place as presented by the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister with substantive responsibility for transport and works. This is an amendment bill, Mr. President, that treats to amend the legislation as it relates to the Transport Authority and to reconcile what is seen to be an irregularity between the powers of authority for the Barbados Transport Authority and the Barbados Licensing Authority. And quite simply put, Mr. President, you have one entity that had the authority to issue a permit and the other entity that did not have the authority to revoke the permit but had the responsibility for regulating the sector. And so, quite simply put, this is a matter which seeks to resolve that irregularity. And so, that is not a complex matter per se, but I think that the broader issues that raise their heads around the substantive matter of public transport are, in fact, perhaps the more complex part of our conversation. Now, Mr. President, my presentation today is going to take you through what the amendments are, the sections which are being amended. Specifically, we have the amendment to Section 4 of the legislation. Section 23 is also being amended and substituted, and we have several subsections taking place, also being amended within those two sections. And so we obviously will be making the recommendation subject to the approval of the Senate following our debate for the overall amendment of the Barbados Transport Authority, now to be called, hopefully, the Amendment Act of 2023, to be able to give effect to the reconciliation of that difference that I just made reference to. But what are some of the broader issues? And I'm always sensitive, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, that I don't talk about the bigger picture. I never talk about the bigger picture, because one of the things that I have always learned is that there is no single bigger picture. There's always a multiplicity, not even a duplicity of issues around any specific thematic area. And so I want to raise about 6 specific issues around which this particular amendment to the legislation is based. This is substantively, one, a matter of regulatory management, and then ultimately, as we have heard also in this place, it is one thing to pass legislation. It is one thing to treat to what legislation is supposed to do. It is another matter to have that legislation enforced. So this is about regulatory management as well as enforcement. Now, Mr. President, let's start there and let's work our way to the other issues that are all, in my view, a part of the broader conversation that our country either is having or needs to have. One, Mr. President, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time specifically on the details of the changes that are being made, because they are fairly simple and fairly clear for all, but I'm just going to go through them in the interest of clarity and for transparency. We currently have the Transport Authority, which is mandated as the regulatory body, and the Transport Authority issues a permit approval letter. The Barbados Licensing Authority issues the permit itself. And the relationship between these two entities is the root of the Transport Authority's inability to adequately and effectively enforce the provisions of the legislation as it relates to the regulatory management of the transportation sector. And in this instance, we're not talking broadly about the transportation sector on its own. We're talking about public service vehicles in particular, and those vehicles that are providing these services to the public. So what we have here, Mr. President, in summary, and what is being rectified, is that the Barbados Licensing Authority, for example, cannot take away what it has not granted. It cannot revoke a permit which is not within its purview. It is actually under the remit of another entity. And so this amendment to the legislation, Mr. President, simply is going to affect that change and make sure that under the Barbados Transport Authority, this matter is now eliminated, allowing the Transport Authority to be the competent entity to take action on all permits despite whomever is the issuing authority. And in this instance, the issuing authority is the Barbados Licensing Authority. And this is meant to assist in the resolution of a number of ills which we are navigating. So having spoken to the simple, in principle matter of regulatory management and then thereafter enforcement, we now come to the what of the transport sector. And what exactly are we talking about when we begin to discuss the public transportation sector, which is my second point, Mr. President. We are speaking about what is effectively a public good. It is a public service, but it is a public good. People have to be able to move from points A to point B safely, efficiently, and in a cost-effective way as well. And public service vehicles, Mr. President, provide a critical service to the public of Barbados. But is that all that we are talking about, Mr. President? I am sure that many of us travel all over the world. We have seen public transportation in effect in different parts of the world. It is amazing to me sometimes that while, Mr. President, many of us use Uber and Lyft when we travel to certain parts of the world, many of us also use public transportation when we travel to other parts of the world in ways that we would not do while we are here in Barbados. So what is our vision for a public transportation sector that allows for there to be effective regulatory management and enforcement of those regulations in a way that makes it a public service and a public good for all to use? Mr. President, I remember the first time I traveled to Switzerland, for example. When you land in Switzerland, you are given, I'm sure you know this as well, Mr. President, because you are extraordinarily well-traveled in places that I'm sure I myself have not even gone. But when you land in Switzerland, for example, and I use this only as an example, as part of your check-in at a hotel, you are given a bus pass. And that bus pass enables you to use the public transportation system anywhere in the city to travel. You have trams, you have buses, and you also have trains. But the bus system is integrated within your hotel sector, and you are issued with a pass. That initial pass can be topped up, Mr. President, by you, but the initial pass is given to you to encourage you to use public transportation. And why is that, Mr. President? One, it is efficient. It is cost-effective. It is timely, it is predictable, and you are comfortable at all levels of service provision with your ability to park your car and to take public transportation. If we go to places like the UK, Mr. President, everybody has an Oyster card. You take the train, and you are comfortable taking the train. I myself, Mr. President, in a previous life, have taken the train from the airport, having landed with luggage, into London, into Victoria Station with luggage, and then taken a taxi from Victoria Station to wherever my hotel is, because public transportation is treated to, in certain jurisdictions, as a public good. In New York City, Mr. President, I'm talking specifically at this point about large developed economies, and I'm going to bring it home to developed economies because we must always compare apples and not apples and oranges. We have in places like New York City, many of us, we may not take the bus, but we most certainly take the train, especially if you are going into places like Manhattan or in London if you're traveling into the city. No one wants to park their cars and have to incur the high toll rates that you incur when you're traveling on certain highways and the high parking rates in certain private car parks, because in like Barbados, you can park it on the side of the road. You either have to put it in a ticket, or either you have to know it's on your phone, you can pay it by your phone, by your app, or you have to go use a parking garage. So people park their cars at home, and in many of these cities, Mr. President, people only use their private vehicles on weekends when they're out traveling with their families or when they're going on longer trips, but they have the opportunity to use public transportation on a day-to-day basis in order to conduct their lives, their livelihoods. You have a public transit system, Mr. President, that has been connected to key arteries in the countries, where you know where key activity rests, where the central business districts are, where the suburban centers are, where you're seeing people, more and more people are living, and the expansion of the transport system follows where people go, Mr. President. These are some of the things that we have seen in advanced economies where public transportation is treated to as a public good for the interest of easing congestion, lowering costs, increasing productivity, allowing people to get to work on time, to and from work on time. And of course, at the same time, this is still that country where we are led by a prime minister walking the length and breadth of the globe, speaking about the climate crisis and reducing our carbon emissions. And therefore, within that framework, Mr. President, the ability of a public to park a car and use public transportation, especially, Mr. President, when public transportation is now, as it is in Barbados, certainly in the public sector, public transportation sector, it is now moving in the direction of electric vehicles where your carbon emissions are lowered. And in the private sector, you would all recall that in the budgetary presentations of this financial year, Mr. President, you also heard that there were concessions extended to public service vehicles to allow them to have the incentives made available to them to also invest in electric and or hybrid vehicles. So there is a coherent approach that has to be taken in this country that supports the evolution of public transportation as a public good. Now, if we, however, look at what has happened in the developing world, Mr. President, in a previous life, I lived in a couple of places. And in each instance, I was fairly convinced that what we describe as the creeping culture in Barbados in public service vehicles, in particular in the private sector, was not an anomaly. In so many other jurisdictions, certainly in East Africa, if you see what they would call the matatus, which are the equivalent to our ZRs, they are oftentimes as indisciplined in every other jurisdiction as I have seen in these ones oftentimes. Yes, of course, there are those who are not in the majority. They do extraordinarily well. They ensure that they represent the best that the sector has to offer. But there is a culture in many circumstances, even in developed economies, Mr. President, like New York City, you only have to be in Manhattan and see the way in which yellow cabs function in principle, because there is a hustle about it. There is a hustle about ensuring that you are able to get a return on your investment. You got to pay for that vehicle though. You got to pay for that car, you got to pay for that van, you got to be able to make your bank payments. And if it is not yours and it is leased, you have to pay the owner what the rates are. And so there's always a culture of hustle, Mr. President, which brings me to my third point. The business of public transportation, Mr. President, has to begin to be treated as a commercial opportunity and a business opportunity where there is a difference between the mere hustle of making a dollar for survival and the ability to have not just a sustainable business and a sustainable business model, but the ability to pass on generational wealth as a result of a business. So, Mr. President, we have with us Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, who in many instances has been an exemplar on issues relating to agriculture. And why would I be speaking about agriculture, Mr. President, in the context of a transportation debate? Mr. President, historically, agriculture may have evolved in many developing countries and small states, even in large countries, from subsistence farming. People farming in their backyards, farming in small quantities to be able to keep themselves and to keep their families. They may sell the excess to their communities and so on. There was a bartering system. But it evolved into, and we have, of course, commercial farms who are there then operating on a much larger scale. Mr. President, what I am calling for and what I'm challenging here in this instance is for us to evolve beyond the need for a hustle that is the public service vehicle community, to become that community, certainly, that is the purveyor of a new business model that allows for there to be generational wealth to be passed on through structured business models around public transportation, where in the same way, Mr. President, you have coaches and larger buses, the BT buses in particular, Mr. President, where you have structured companies that have been established. And those structured companies have boards of directors, they have owners, they have shareholders. Under my own ministry, Mr. President, and why this is important to me, the business of public transportation, is because we have a small business unit. We have a cooperatives unit, Mr. President. I would like to be able to see more and more of the public service vehicles where many of the drivers, many of the conductors, many of the small players are able to sit with the ministry with responsibility for business and the financing agencies that also rest within the ministry to form transportation cooperatives amongst themselves where they become even greater owners of capital. So they're not responding to, when I heard some of the commentary in the other place, Mr. President, when I was preparing for this debate, we were talking about the thresholds sometimes being set by owners on a daily basis. You have to be able to bring home this amount. You have to be able to have a minimum to hand over to the owner, and then the excess profits is where you get paid. And so there's an incentive to hustle, Mr. President, what we're calling for, Mr. President, in the same way that we have done so in the entrepreneurship space, where the hustle of selling something on the side of the road, or we have legalized the vending zones, and we have put the arrangements in place so that vendors are not criminalized for small-scale activity. We now are making sure that we're able to ensure that under the TAP program, more and more private sector vehicles come into the structure of the public service sector. But at the same time, Mr. President, I would wish to see an empowerment taking place, and I'm committed to making sure that my team in the ministry with responsibility for business is able to then use the same resources, Mr. President, that have been used under the TAP program, because the TAP program is actually administered under fund access under the Ministry of Business. The provision of resources have been provided under the Ministry of Business. And equally so, we will now commit to moving into a space where, together with the Ministry with responsibility for Transport and Works and the Transport Authority, where we can focus with them on the business of empowerment and enfranchisement, and financial enfranchisement in particular, of those persons who are functioning now as employees within the sector and not only the owners of capital. We have to be able to expand that. Mr. President, this is a government who said that we want to be able to ensure that homeowners have the right to renewable energy. It created a framework where people were enfranchised, even for the matter for in space of renewable energy. We have a UCAL which exists, Mr. President, because a government wanted to ensure that there was a provision for the repair and maintenance of public service vehicles, and where people, through their unions, were enfranchised. Equally so, Mr. President, I believe that the business of public transportation will allow us to resolve some of the hustle that has been created as a consequence of these daily rates that are being provided oftentimes by owners. This, Mr. President, brings me to the fourth point that I want to raise, which is this. We talk a lot about public transportation, we talk about enfranchisement, we talk about inclusion. Social inclusion, Mr. President, is what we're talking about. There is a culture that we have been describing almost in a way which is derogatory, Mr. President. Them van men, them van conductors, them minibus men. It is almost as though they're not a part of us. And in so doing, Mr. President, what we have seen and we have experienced it even in the education sector, and I have stood in this place on more than one occasion, Mr. President, and said that we often practice a brand of social sifting, where it is us versus them, where we make a determination that people are not like us and so they don't belong with us. And equally so, when we begin to repeat that narrative over and over again, people believe it. They feel as though they are the outcasts of society. They feel as though they don't belong or they don't have a place, and they start to behave it. So we, in some ways, Mr. President, by our social exclusion of many of the persons within this space, we have also contributed, perhaps unknowingly or unwittingly, to creating the environment where they don't feel the need to fit into some of these social norms, because they feel as though we don't understand. We don't understand the hustle, Mr. President, what it means to have to find $400 a day. So yes, the things that irritate me, and I'm sure, Mr. President, all of us drove here today, or were driven here today, and there is nobody in here who did not see on the way, whether long or short here, a public service vehicle doing some foolishness on the road. It is not possible. Everybody must have seen it because it is everywhere. But we have to find a way to ensure that these persons who are making a living for their families, who are no less legitimate than ours, and that they also understand that they have a role to play in ensuring the social fabric of this country is maintained. But let us be clear, Mr. President, let us also be clear, because I'm not spending a long time on this particular conversation today, because I believe that a lot has been said, and there will come, obviously, an opportunity to say more a little later on in the morning. But let us be clear, Mr. President, we can't be hypocritical either. We have to speak more broadly about how we as a society function, not just the PSV sector. Mr. President, I remember when I was learning to drive. When I was learning to drive, I had to go, they had driving instructors, the driving instructors were trained, and the driving instructors would train me. Now, you have all kinds of people whose practices themselves on the road are problematic, teaching other people their bad practices, and they're in turn internalizing them on the roads. Mr. President, have you passed anywhere, Mr. President, anymore, a PSV vehicle that drive and it will stop in the middle of the road? It can stop in the middle of the road because they don't want the PSV vehicle coming behind it to overtake it and get the passengers in front. But Mr. President, don't let me be hypocrites. We have a culture evolving in this country where people no longer feel the need to pull over to the side when they stop and they're not driving a PSV vehicle. They're driving their own private cars. You see people stop in the middle of the road and don't pull to the curb so other cars can pass around. There's nobody behind them that they're stopping it, trying to prevent from overtaking them. Do you have people, Mr. President, who don't feel the need to use their indicators anymore? So the courtesies of saying to a person, I am turning left or I am turning right, don't exist anymore, Mr. President. This morning, as I was driving into Parliament, just out there in front of Parliament, I was driving in, Mr. President, and a man stopped not to the side of the road to talk to somebody, in the middle of the road to talk to somebody. He had business with the fact that there's a car behind him, not interested. And so there has to be a conversation in this country, Mr. President, where we are not pointing fingers at others, where four fingers are pointing back at us. We, as a people, have to do better on the roads of this country. I am seeing more and more people driving with their cell phones to their ear. Last I checked, in this very chamber, we passed legislation on what was to be done with cell phones, hands-free. So you either are using your car to have your car phone on, or your phone is on speaker, but it cannot be in your hands. But you have Barbadians who will be shouting up and down from the mountaintop about the PSVs, which may be wrong, but focus on if you are wrong too in what you are doing. And so our indiscipline on the roads is reflected, Mr. President, not just in the PSV sector, but in private cars as well. And Barbados needs to do better overall, because what we are seeing is a level of indiscipline. I heard another member in the other place speaking about how people behave when they're wrong. So me, I'm driving in this morning, somebody stopped in the middle of the road, you want to talk to somebody on the road, me, I'm touching my horn. Because you know, if you toot your horn even gently, well, you don't wait. That's how we behave. And it's not an acceptable way of being, Mr. President. And the message that I want to make clear here today is that we have to stop practicing this exceptionalism in this country, where we can see everything that is wrong with everybody else, and we may be right about what is wrong with everybody else. But we also have to be responsible for what is wrong with us, what we are doing wrong as well. And so I am making a call to Barbadians to exercise greater responsibility and respect for others on the road. Not just PSV, but let us start and lead by example by persons driving their individual vehicles, their privately owned vehicles, to function with a level of respect and consideration on roads of Barbados for other fellow road users. So many of the incidents and the accidents and road rage that we see on the road can be avoided by practicing simple consideration for others. Indicator, Mr. President, is not a decorative thing in your car. Ain't there just for so. Gone are the days where when you were learning to drive, you had the window and you used to put your hand down or flag down. You used to indicate whether you're turning left, if you're turning right. Indicators inside your car for that. Use them. Let other road users know where you are going. Stop coming to a sudden stop in the middle of the road without indicating to other road users what you are doing. And so, Mr. President, even as we speak about the indiscipline among some members of the PSV sector, I am calling on Barbadians generally to minimize the indiscipline that they are practicing themselves. It is a problem, all of us know it, and we can see it, Mr. President. And so we need to change the public narrative about us versus them. It has to be all of we. All of us, Mr. President, which is my fifth point, have a responsibility for maintaining safety and efficiency on our roads. Let us be respectful of others. So, Mr. President, where I started when I was describing what happens in other developed societies and what we see sometimes in other places has to be where I come to my sixth and my final point, which is transforming Barbados. Mr. President, we as a government have spoken at great length about what were in 2018 identified as the mission critical items on our agenda. Then we became a country that spoke about the mission survival during COVID. And as at last year, you heard our Prime Minister speaking at great length about mission transformation. Now we are in transformation mode. And so while we are talking about what may appear to be a simple amendment to the regulations, and while we've talked about what overall we're hoping to be able to see, we have a Ministry of Transport and Works, Mr. President, that is working through what that is meant to look like. 49 electric vehicles already on the road, Mr. President, financed through the Smart Energy Program under the Ministry of Energy. You have a further 10 that are being expected to join the fleet, and you also have a further 10 being incorporated. In the budgetary statements of 2023, Mr. President, you have the provision and the extension of concessions offered to electric and hybrid vehicles, also in the public service vehicles in the PSV sector. So you have public vehicles, private vehicles now providing that public good, having access to concessionary terms in order to make sure that we are electrifying the fleet and remaining true to our climate goals and our energy transition goals. We also have, Mr. President, a transport authority that is now being reformed beyond this simple amendment, and you have heard the Minister with responsibility for Transport and Works speak about what this is meant to look like. And you heard the work that was done by the previous ministers with responsibility for Transport and Works, because government is a continuum. And in most instances, if you see something being done today, oftentimes, and you have heard, this is work that has been underway for 15 years, and certainly in an aggressive way over the last year and a half of this administration. So the reform of the Barbados Transport Authority, and the Prime Minister has spoken about the introduction of a mass transit authority, which speaks to the overall transportation sector. This is part of the transformational agenda that brings Barbados into first class, best in class space. These are some of the things that are being proposed. We have heard about a cashless system, which has already been piloted in many of the public sector vehicles, and the proposal is that that is to be further expanded. Most of the public sector vehicles have already been outfitted with the cashless equipment, and the expectation is that once this is rolled out, we're able to see a further expansion and the incorporation into the PSV sector as well. We've heard, Mr. President, of the integration as well of training. Certainly, I can recall when I was in the Ministry of Tourism with responsibility for tourism, the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc., through its product division, spent an extensive amount of time in training, ensuring that persons, in particular in the taxi sector, were trained and in a position to provide the best quality service, not just to Barbadians and visitors, but to everyone who was in a public service vehicle. So we have to ensure that that service culture is transformational as well, where people feel as though they are sitting in a vehicle which is world class, Mr. President. I have been in countries where, funny story, last year, I think it was, last year, I went to the Dominican Republic for a meeting. And they usually, as you all would know, provide transportation for ministers on arrival, and they take them to their hotel. So my office had arranged for my arrival, and so they said they were sending transportation. They met us as usual on disembarkation from the plane, got Mr. President to the area where we were supposed to be collected, and the officer who was with me, they said, oh, well, the vehicle is on their way, Minister. When the vehicle showed up, that remains a story for the legends, and we have talked about it ever since. Every time I see the officer, we talk and laugh about it, Mr. President. The vehicle showed up, and it had you know how we used to have midnight thunder painted on the front of a vehicle? The vehicle showed up and it had the scripting on the front. I said, what is going on? What is this? They said, no, it is an executive vehicle. And the thing was painted on the front. When I got into the vehicle, there was nothing executive about it, but we were rolling with the punches. I like a good adventure as much as the next person, so I was up for it. Let me go. So we got into the vehicle, we gone on the road. Mr. President, in Barbados, certainly our tourism officials, we will take you on the public main roads. We can carry you on the highways, we can take you on the major roads. We don't normally cut through back roads, that kind of way we'll be carrying our dignitaries who are visiting the country. Not in the DR, that was not my story. So I am midnight assassin, I guess you could call it that. And I am driving through all kind of roads that I swear any minute now somebody can jump out of some kind of dark bush and we can get ambushed. And at one point I was quipping to the officer, I said, call for help, call for help. And the officer said to me, I can fight, we good. I can fight. When we finally got to the hotel, when the meeting was being held, they could not even find the entrance. We went around some back roads, the place was dark, and it took us to what I can only assume was the back of the hotel. And the protocol officer who was receiving us had to then find their way to us. But in summary, Mr. President, the ability of our tourism officials in Barbados to work along with public sector vehicles to ensure that those persons who are contracted to work in certain spaces because they own the vehicles is not something that can be minimized, because there is a certain standard to which Barbados is accustomed, certain standard that we have set that would never have allowed a midnight assassin to collect a dignitary at the airport, and certainly never would have allowed us to go through back roads in the middle of all kind of dark, dank places in the night where there were no street lights and men standing up on the corner looking a little dodgy. So, but, you know, I'm up for the adventure, and it worked out well on that occasion, so it's all good. But, Mr. President, I think we have to be clear that Barbados must always be best in class. Barbados has a standard that has been set. And so whether you are driving, because we have the number of permits that have been issued, Mr. President, especially in the taxi sector, because we are accustomed to having fancy vehicles as taxis in the country. And we're also accustomed to having now public sector buses that are air-conditioned and have Wi-Fi. So we have a standard that has been set. And so the transformation of the public sector, transportation sector in Barbados, Mr. President, must equally be at that high level. It must be at that best-in-class level. It must mean that those providing the services, whether they be the drivers or the conductors, that they are the best in class, that they are providing world-class service that is being mirrored elsewhere in the world, where persons can stand and say, it is not that the matatu culture in Uganda, in Kampala, is no different than the three-legged vehicles, the moped culture in Indonesia, in Bali, and it's no different than the ZR culture in Barbados, but instead, that Barbados is that exemplar where our public service vehicles and our public transportation system is that which is being described in the same terms that I would speak of with Switzerland. Prime Minister Motley has a way, she's a hard taskmaster, and she has a way of saying to us, she ain't buying the Skoda nor the Cortina. She wants Barbados in 2023 to buy the Rolls Royce. What is best in class? She's not benchmarking against the lowest common denominator. She wants us to benchmark against the best in class. And so this is what we are aiming for. It is not going to be done overnight. And the Honourable Minister with responsibility for transportation has said that there are specific regulations that are meant to go along with this amendment, which will then allow for the further elaboration of what the regulatory and the enforcement regime is going to look like. And I'm certain that over time you will hear even more about how Barbados is transforming its public transportation sector to ensure that we are absolutely best in class. This is the matter that we are beginning, because we haven't dealt with it in full here today, Mr. President, we are beginning to deal with in these amendments which are before the Honourable Chamber. And I want, Mr. President, before I sit and take my seat, to repeat now that we are joined by our Honourable colleague, my comments which I made earlier, I don't want to depend on him taking the time to go back to YouTube to hear after the fact the glowing tribute that I paid to him on behalf of the Honourable, the Senate, in particular the government senators. Senator Rogers, welcome. I did say earlier before you joined us that we were here with you in this place when you, I think we were in the other building at the time, when you achieved the accomplishment of your doctorate, and we were celebrating with you then, and that you are now among us still, and you have achieved the recognition of a canon, and we are incredibly proud to share space with you. And I did say to all of Barbados, and certainly to this chamber, that you are an exemplary professional in your own right and an amazing human being, and we are proud to share space with you. And so with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Other speakers? Senator Paris.
Mr. President, I rise to support the bill before this chamber today, which is seeking to amend the transport, to do an amendment to the Transport Authority Amendment Act. And in doing so, it is given the Transport Authority functions and helping it to regularize the sector for which we are going to be debating today. Mr. President, for too long, we have seen the level of indiscipline by the operators within this sector. It causes us frustration on the road. And I can agree with the leader of government business because this morning I witnessed not one, but two sets of, I don't know what to call them, but indiscipline by these operators on the road. We see daily, again, both on social media and in person, the indiscipline that is exhibited by them. It is as if they are saying, we have a license to do whatever we want to do, whenever we want to do it. And they have no consideration for other road users. Though they are stopped by the police and whatever, they continue to do as they like. Over the years, the Transport Authority has been unable to properly enforce the provisions of the Act. And they relied on the Barbados Police Service and the Barbados Licensing Authority to do the enforcement and the sanctions the PSVs who continue to be indisciplined. Mr. President, with these amendments, it will give the Transport Authority the power to govern, while at the same time bringing law and order on the roads of this country. I refer to the Act where it says that the licensing authority will now have and be able to at any time review the decision to issue or refuse a permit or suspend or revoke any permit issue. So simply, if you are not conforming, your permit can be revoked. I see these amendments going forward, given the lawbreakers and the few disorderly drivers. There are few. I don't believe that all of the PSV drivers are indisciplined. There are a few that need to be controlled, and conductors as well. So the penalties for their indiscipline will be managed by the Transport Authority. These are needed and would assist with the frustration we, the other road users, are presently confronted with. Mr. President, both the owners, the drivers, and the conductors of the PSVs who are in breach of the conditions of the license and or permit issues will now be accountable to the Transport Authority. Mr. President, with the enforcement of these regulations, the authority will now have the ability to monitor the day-to-day activities of the PSV operators. And how will they do this? They will do it with the assistance of inspectors. Mr. President, to achieve this, though, inspectors will be critical in ensuring that this is done. Inspectors and the valuable role they play is nothing new to some of us here in this chamber. We are aware that private concessionaires like Elite and the Rockling, back in the day, you had inspectors on board the buses. Now, these inspectors, or checkers, or spies, as they were called back then, would be seen at bus stops where they get on board the buses and they would work with the conductor. They would look at the waybill to ensure that the waybill and the passengers are in sync. They also looked at the uniforms of the conductors to make sure that they were in order. And on occasions, when the driver was going too fast, they would have been cautioned by these inspectors. The inspectors could stop the bus. They got on the buses and they drive from one bus stop to 2 or 3 bus stops on the road until they were finished doing the checking. I do believe that it is time that we bring these inspectors. Presently, there are only 2 inspectors who are with the Barbados Licensing Authority, and there are with the Transport Authority. That is not enough, and I'm asking the Ministry of Transport, Works and Water Resources to make sure that we, where they have the vacancies, to make sure that we employ these persons and allow them to assist in bringing law and order back to the streets. We also need to have them in the bus terminals, on the roads, so that they can see the behavior, and are also exposed to how long it is taking the buses to go from point A to point B, and how long they will see how long the commuters are standing waiting on public transport. I think the time is right for us to bring back the inspectors who will bring some law and order back on the road. These inspectors will get the opportunity as well to see the PSV vehicles who are going off route, driving through neighborhoods, putting the lives of persons in danger, and just to get ahead of the other PSV so that they can collect. Again, we know why they're doing it, but it is not safe, so we want to bring an end to it, and I'm sure that the inspectors would assist. We have some other vehicles. They are not all public service vehicles who ZRs, they're not only ZRs and minibuses, but we have taxis, maxi taxis, and those that are plying routes in other areas that they do not have the appropriate permits for. So this needs to be controlled as well. Mr. President, I know that the inspectors brought law and order and accountability to the concessionaires back then. And I am very sure if more inspectors are employed by the Transport Authority, it would bring some much needed order and accountability and discipline to this sector. Mr. President, this amendment is seeking to correct the indiscipline on our streets by a few of these drivers and conductors, and are not all of them, like I said earlier, are not guilty, but we need to have them adhere to the traffic rules. Mr. President, we are also familiar with the dress code being enforced and being used by these conductors and ZR drivers. And when the inspectors, like I said earlier, come on board, we no longer will be seeing them wearing, and I know they do, I see it daily, wearing dirty clothes, have their underwears exposed and stuff like that. We will now have the dress code regularized. And abruptly stopping in front of you to bring a person across the street from a mile away to get just that passenger, that will be stopped. So, Mr. President, the owners and operators are accountable for the behavior. And with this amendment, they can now have their license suspended when they do wrong. In closing, Mr. President, I again pledge my support to the amendment to the Transport Authority Act. And I am sure that, like me, there are several other road users who are looking forward to discipline by operators and owners within this sector, and that they too would welcome more inspectors on the road to assist in controlling the indiscipline we now see exhibited. And with those few words, Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Paris. Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good day to all the honorable senators. I, first of all, wish to thank through you, sir, the leader of government business, for the kind words and words of congratulations and well wishes. If she had gone on a little longer, I suspect some people may have done like the lady at the funeral who went to check in the coffin to see if it was really her husband there. But thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Cummings, for the kind words. Much has been said by the leader of government business, Senator Cummings, and Senator Paris on this matter, which I believe we can all concur with. I, however, wish to ask the question, because I may have missed it, why do we need this legislation? Isn't there already a regulatory body for PSVs and licenses and that kind of thing? I'm just asking the question. I think it was mentioned the licensing authority has the authority to do this. So what will the transport authority have that the license authority doesn't have? Okay, I may have missed something then. Because I'm just thinking, this is not so much a problem of just the PSV operators. This is a societal problem. So why do we need to take away the licenses of these people, and what is causing it? I've heard much said about the PSV drivers and so on, and the hustle. And we all know the hustle. Those of us who went to UE and had to catch the number 3 bus understand what the hustle is. And if you somehow had to get off the number 3 bus and then catch a number 11 with some of the notorious drivers that we had then, you would understand what the hustle is. But I've often said something. We always talk about boys on the block. But I've always felt that part of the problem was not the boys on the block, but the girls behind the boys on the block. And so while we talk about, by that I mean, sir, let me just explain. When you have to get a weave and hairdo, dress, money for the fete, and all kinds of things, nails and all kinds of things before the fete happens. And the guy has to provide these things, and he doesn't have all the means to provide them. He has to get them somewhere if he wants to go with the girl to the fete. And so my question is, who is behind the hustle? Who is behind the hustle? And I think that's what we need to get to here. Because what we're seeing is just what manifests itself on the surface. But there's something deeper here that is forcing. You know, there used to be a dub song, and Senator Cummings may know this one, having spent some time in Jamaica. Woman is a problem to a man when Friday evening comes. Because when he doesn't have any money to provide anything, he's in trouble. And when you have to go home to a household of crying children and so on, and you don't have what to provide, you feel less a man. And so I agree with Senator Cummings that there needs to be some structure in this sector where rates are set and people do not have to be scrambling around every day, putting themselves and others at risk, just to make sure that when they get home, woman is not a problem to a man when Friday evening comes, because it's a very serious thing. But in addition to that, let us not forget the nonsense that used to take place on the road. I don't know if it still does. I heard Senator Parris's call for regulators and inspectors and so on, but I wouldn't be lining up for that job. For anybody who is doing the what? Walking the dog and the milkshake and all those things. By a drone, and take a picture and we'll deal with that. But to ask people to be on some of these vehicles with some of the craziness that is done is really putting their lives at risk as well. I always remember a gentleman, I wouldn't say who he is, but his car was down and he had to catch a ZR. And he was put in the front seat, he was sitting in the front seat, and this driver was driving recklessly. And he asked him, but can't you just slow down a bit? He said, slow down for what? Life is like an egg, you drop it, it's gone. Life is like an egg, you drop it, it's gone. And these are the things that commuters face every day out there. So while there is the challenge of the persons behind the struggle, the hustle whom we must deal with, we must also deal with some of the lawlessness that is taking place on the roads. And I'm happy to see that we are mindful to revoke licenses and so on at this point in time. The biggest challenge we will have is that when you live in a society that is as small as this, somebody knows somebody who could put in a word for somebody with somebody else. And then nothing gets done. And so if we really want to regulate this sector, we will have to be serious about the revocation of licenses. We'll have to be serious about some of the stringent measures that we are calling for here. And we'll have to implement them regardless of who the persons are or who they're connected to. That is the only way we're going to do something about this problem, because at the end of the day, it's our children, it's people who are just trying to make an honest living and may not have the wherewithal to have their own vehicle, who are relying on these drivers who are putting their lives in peril, in one case because of lawlessness, maybe in another instance because of the hustle. And we have to deal with this and deal with it in a serious way. With those few words, I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Cameron Rogers. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I'm grateful for the opportunity to join in the debate on the Transport Authority Amendment Bill. Certainly, sir, I echo the sentiments of my colleague, Canon Rogers. And I want to begin, sir, by associating myself with the comments of the Leader of the Senate and congratulating him on his preferment in his field. I've known him for a very long time, and I cannot think of a more deserving appointment. I believe I can piggyback on one of the comments that he just made, sir, that this is a means to address what is really a wider societal problem. And in an earlier contribution to this debate, sir, I posited the view that we need to start thinking seriously about transport and the delivery of mass transport services as the delivery of a public utility service. And I'm heartened by the words of the leader of the Senate and from the substantive minister in the other place as to the movement towards the creation of a mass transit authority to deal with the management and the rollout of a more effective and efficient transportation service for Barbadians. And while I support all of the amendments, and I propose, sir, to deal with it, some of them specifically, because sometimes in our second reading speeches, we speak in a much broad systemic way about the issues. But when we look at the provisions of the bill, and I will come to them in due course, Mr. President, during the course of my presentation, we will see that these things are very, very necessary and address a number of challenges that we have had for 20, 30 years and things that we have not properly addressed as a country. But sir, last time I spoke on the bill in relation to the road traffic, I noticed that there was some public criticism by the minibus sector to the notion that I suggested that one of the causes of the problems that we experience with the public sector vehicles on the road, the privately owned ones, is as a result of the way in which the workers are paid. And I don't think that you can escape the real connection between the methodology by which owners require them to deliver a certain amount of money at the end of a day and they can take the rest as something that's not directly contributing to the hustle that they are required. Because if you have to pay a owner of $300, $400, $500, $600, I don't know what is the actual going rate a day, and then whatever you make is yours, it therefore puts the entire country at risk. And we're not, sir, talking only about the passengers who have to travel on these vehicles and are exposed to risk while being a passenger in these vehicles. We're not only talking about people who are driving on the roads, but sir, in my experience, and let me give you an example, the starting point for a sentence for motor vehicular manslaughter in Barbados comes out of a case of a ZR driver knocking down a man opposite DV South Wings and breaking over 20-something bones in his body, where he overtook 4 vehicles and knocked the man almost 30 feet away from the point of impact. So when criminal lawyers are speaking about motor vehicular manslaughter, that is the case that you got as a precedent. When we speak about sentencing people for sexual assaults on minors, again, the starting point is a case associated with minibus men who took some girls from school and were out at Free Houses Park with these girls during the course of the day. And these are the things that I believe when Senator Dr. Cameron Rogers referred to as a societal problem that we have been observing and not necessarily doing the things to address these problems. And this behavior cannot continue unabated, and this is the reason why the government has, in my view, stopped poking at the issue and start to play some shots. And I associate myself with the amendments before the Senate today because we cannot continue to have a public transport system where the majority of the public transport system is privately owned. But because of the way in which it is rolled out in the country, the random way in which people can operate the vehicles and in off-peak hours, take them off the road because they've made enough money or they felt that they've made enough money, the owner's got enough money, then the burden disproportionately shifts to the state-run aspect of the public transport system in the off-peak hours to get everybody at home at night. And it costs the taxpayers and the country millions of dollars because the transport board cannot operate in a way to maximize profits or the investment that the state puts into the sector because it is uncompetitive. The transport board, by and large, is the smallest player in the sector because the sector is largely privately owned. So that this lopsided way in which we have viewed the rollout of public transport needs to be addressed. And I believe the starting point, Mr. President, has to be that we need to look at this sector as the delivery of a public utility service, where we can set standards, where we can address the issues that arise because we will have information and statistics that guide how not only routes are allocated, but how the profits within the sector are allocated. I, for one, don't believe, sir, that a owner of a minibus should be assigned a specific route where they can only ply their trade on that route and that route alone. That was how the sector was constructed in the 70s in the reorganization of the whole thing when the minibuses came into being. Because I grew up in a Barbados before there were ZRs. And there was an overspill. And the reason why we have had to have this overflow is because the state-run transport board can never cover the entire gamut of transportation services required in the country. So we had ZMs at first. And then they moved to ZRs because you gave them a route. Some of us went to school when Suzuki vans that were supposed to carry light goods became the basis upon which people were to get around this country. If you went to Commonwealth School, Mr. President, you will understand those days. And those vehicles were modified. And when I was going to school in the 80s and the 90s, sir, you heard of reports where 25 school children in a Suzuki carry. All in the papers, and we marvel at these things. I don't want to be tempted, Mr. President, to get any difference between the two because I went to both of them. And so we have been dealing with this problem for a long time. And sir, you know I'm very prone to look at these things through the instrumentation of the music of the era. Because I remember Kids Sight, before it became popular as a calypsonian, had a song about the minibus man on the hustle. That the Ira and all these fellas who sang just before the news, they had to watch the news in those days, Rankin, Ricky, and these fellas, the minibus culture, because people call it a subculture at the time, was fighting back in terms of its living. And it has always been with us, but it provides a vital service to the people, because certainly in rural Barbados, and where I come from in St. Thomas, you could not find a transport road bus going to Jackson. So people who live in Shop Hill, Alice, Melrose, Chancery, those areas had to walk long distances in order to access the transport board bus. So that we could not do without this vital aspect of our transport sector provided by the minibuses. And not all are bad, and we know all are not bad, sir. I went to school on mornings on B136, and Gary used to play Joseph Nels' Assistant Marshal on the first couple of trips. every morning, and it was not what we wanted to hear, because we had enough of that on a Sunday at church. But the truth is that it put you in a different mindset, so that if you're too late and you had to catch 184 or 186, there was a different type of music that was played there. But we had to get to school early, and that was we knew when the bus was coming up from town. And it was a different time. But the sector has really, really got out of hand. And I remember, sir, when the government of the day, the Barbados Labour Party administration in the mid-1990s, justified the almost doubling of the taxes for licensing fees on this sector on the basis of the amount of resources that had to be expended to police the sector. And that was the justification used by the government at the time. But the truth is, sir, that the increased licensing fees, the increased fines imposed by the courts, the suspension of licenses and these things has done really little to dent the very things that we are trying to legislate and the oncoming of the rules and the regulations. I can only hope that the inspectorate to which my colleague Senator Parish referred would be given more ample resources to be able to nip these things in the bud. But the truth is that we have been grappling with ways to deal with this indiscipline on the roads, the danger on the roads for a long time. And it seems that the heavy hand has not been sufficient, because the truth is that I know of a time when the minibuses parked their vehicles behind the main yard, went to court, and the magistrate of the day in the District A Magistrates Court, traffic, used to make sure that those traffic cases were called last. But the same minibus men, some of them, will be seen back in court 2 and 3 days later for offenses and infractions incurred on the day that they were last in court. And if you check the statistics, because for me, we need to have a proper way of analyzing this problem. We look at the data collected from the magistrates' courts. It would tell us a story, not only as to why these things happen, but how we can curb this behavior. And it leads me to the view, sir, that if we were to change the system where a licensed vehicle was put into a pool and an entity, either style the Mass Transit Authority or some kind of public institution, were to allocate these vehicles on the basis of the need determined by looking at the data, by analyzing where people want to go. Because you are issuing largely no licenses from Bridgetown to somewhere in Barbados. And we are not necessarily certain whether the demographic movement of people in Barbados requires home to town to work anymore. Certainly the emergence of urban centers, when we look at the physical development plan of the 1980 and the one in the 1990s and one in 2003, last issued by under the leadership of the Deputy President of the Senate, we see the emergence of town centers and commercial centers across Barbados as a result of the development of the ABC Highway to a large extent, in Warrens, in Wildy, in 6 roads, in whole town, connecting I think that is a sign of approval that I mentioned my colleague. But if we look at these areas, there is no reason why somebody trying to go to St. James, coming from the eastern side of Barbados, should have to go to town to get into another vehicle in town to get to St. James, and vice versa. So the time for issuing a permit in the way in which we issue these permits has to change. And I don't believe we are doing a good thing to the owners and holders of these permits to issue them a one route. Some people might get a very lucrative route, But the truth is that there are people in parts of Barbados that cannot get proper transport service. And the first call and demand is that the government should send a transport or bus into that area. And it might be true that it might be able to get a morning service and an evening service, but then after that, the route is largely unprofitable because people have gone to school and work. So that the Mass Transit Authority, Mass Transport Authority, or the Transport Authority has to be able to run a transport service where the owners of these vehicles can put them into a system where they are allocated on the basis of need and the revenue shared in a proportionate way to the vehicles being able to apply the routes, apply them on time, because vehicles will break down and so forth. But that system can be developed because it is my belief that until we start to look at this holistically and not where an owner can say to the operators, bring me $500 while they all want y'all can keep. When the fellas make enough money, then pull the vehicle off the road. When the road is dead, like now, the vehicles will not be working, but somebody who has to get to work for afternoon shift on the West Coast or in the South Coast in the hotel sector or somewhere, or has to do a job in terms of the gig economy. Or people wanting to move around the country at their leisure, have no incentive to put down their cars. When all of us get the opportunity to travel, we realize that people in North America and in Europe and stuff have uses of their private vehicles and also public transport, depending on where they're going. When we visit our families, we recognize it's not always moving in a car. Sometimes you're moving the subway or the train or the metro, depending on the distances you have to travel or how fast you have to go and get back. We need to be able to analyze the data, and I'm hoping that some form of data analytics is employed by the Transport Authority to determine how people move. I am intrigued, sir, by the concept of being able to use an area like Warrens or areas near Warrens as a transport exchange hub. That has to be on the cards for the future development of the country. Because if, for example, you live in the north of the island, there's no reason why you have to drive along the ABC highway to go to the airport. You should be able to dispatch your relatives or friends to a transport exchange system in Warrens, and they take that bus that goes straight to the airport, leaving every hour. And move people around the island. And we want to talk about 24-hour economy. This cannot be done if we are talking about moving around in cars. So we have to look at an area where we can get people to come from the east to the west, from the north to the south, and vice versa, through an exchange point where you get on a bus and transfer without having to pay an additional new fare. And offer the services where all of the operators of the vehicles are paid a flat salary, where they don't have to break the law, create inconveniences for people on the road, drive slowly during the slow periods, keeping back traffic on Highway 1, because if you ever catch Mr. President on Highway 1 trying to go to Holtown Court at this time or coming back behind 2 or 3 public sector vehicles running, you're not getting anywhere in a hurry. They call it dragging, right? Right indicator on, as one of my colleagues is saying, so it can't overtake. All of this happens because they have to look for passengers in order to make a certain amount of money. We have been poking at this issue for too long, sir. We talk about cashless systems. This cannot be a mystery in an era when every child in Barbados has access to instantaneous technology. It cannot be a mystery why we cannot implement a cashless system in public transport. And the issues that the operators have with the Transport Board and the TAP program, that can be alleviated by having a transit card. From the time they tap, we know instantaneously from a central database that somebody who's a pensioner, a police officer, or a school child who the state subsidizes has used your bus. So we don't have to say, well, look, man, these figures look inflated, and have that continuous argument between the Transport Board and the private operators who are doing an important role in moving people for and on behalf of the Transport Board, having that argument consistently over and over and over all of the time. We need to move to a system where you get a card, we call it the Metro card, or you call it the Oyster in other countries. It is a card that we use. You tap and you go. Some people might say it might eliminate the conductors. But sir, this is not value-added employment. If an operator wants to have a conductor, so be it. But the convenience of being able to get on a vehicle, tap and move, is something that people in a regularly organized society do on a daily basis without any hindrance. And we need to stop letting these little issues keep us back from moving on. Cameras on these buses so we can know where your children are. So they can when we have in terms of these school buses and stuff, we need to have cameras on these buses, especially the school buses, to make sure that our children are safe. And safe from we know what in the society. We hiding from these things, sir. These regulations don't cover all of the ills, but certainly it is expected that with the ability of the Transport Authority to issue, suspend, and cancel licenses of drivers and conductors, to issue, suspend, and cancel the permits, and to review the decision to issue a permit, it gives them real power. These amendments are important, but certainly it places an undue burden on the regulators of the sector to keep everybody within here. So Senator Parsons is right, we need inspectors, but the inspectors will not create good behavior. The inspectors will deal with the ones who misbehave. And when the misbehavior is calculated by them as well, we will deal with the punishment until we can't work anymore. Because, I mean, you imagine when you look at the newspapers and you see a situation where a gentleman called Bashment Monkey, he makes the headlines because he's back driving on the road with hundreds and hundreds of convictions behind his name. Because the government institutions, the Transport Authority, the Licensing Authority are not working lockstep to ensure that a character like that is alleged to have committed hundreds of these offenses, but the system cannot adequately safeguard the public transport sector from situations like that. I'm not judging him or any other operator, sir, but certainly it is nothing to laugh at when we associate that kind of name with the delivery of public transport. The bashment culture we hear is associated with the transport sector. That is not proper for us to continue to allow as a government and as a society and as a people, a dignified people, that we feel that that is something that, man, the fellas are gonna make a little money and what else we can do? It is to our eternal detriment that this system has got out of hand. And I do believe, sir, that now is the time to start to discuss how do we move people in and around Barbados in a way that is safe and convenient. I endorse the view of the leader of the Senate that we need to start thinking about having a transport system where if I want to leave home to go somewhere, I may opt to leave my car and take the bus and get there on time and get back safely. And it cannot be that a vehicle is sitting down in a bus stand waiting for people to board it in town in order for that bus to get to some place close to me in an hour or 45 minutes. It must be that we must be able to almost do a call, and routes are allocated almost simultaneously based on the algorithm that determines how people want to move at any given point in time, and a response can almost be done. Technology is available to do all of these things. And when I speak about transport being conceptualized as a public utility service, sir, I am serious, because it then means that we can have that flexibility in order to respond to where people are. It would take a situation where we have a lot of serious accidents, people falling asleep at the wheel. Some people might have had too much to drink or might be tired, whole day at work, party all night, and you see all of these unfortunate accidents every year in the summer. We can all move around Barbados to the parties and effects if we had a reliable public transport system. But it is now hampered, sir, because these operators are stuck to the routes. If they go off route, police report them. They got to take a chance, go through back street or side street to get away from the police or something like that. No, we can then know, well, they got, what's the fact that the boys supposed to know? Big fat. Huh? Puff of color. Yeah. And you know that people want to get home from puff of color. And you send the vehicles and operate so that people can choose, you know, that we can get there and so forth. But there is no reason why we cannot make the venues in Barbados more accessible to Barbadians and visitors alike by creating a mechanism where there's adequate transport to and from those facilities and those events as they occur. We have too many attractions in Barbados that are outside the reach of ordinary Barbadians. And when the buses break down in the transport board, there is even more pressure on them because they do not have the ability to do the things that we would like them to do, to take Barbadians around the scenic tours. Are things of the past because the bus availability is not like what it used to be, right? So moving around the country on Saturdays and Sundays at your leisure, Barbados is a very beautiful country that a lot of Barbadians have not access. So where I come from, people know about Harson's Cave, but it's almost as equally beautiful a cave, it might be more dangerous, called Cole's Cave in St. Thomas. You don't go there when the rain is falling, you go there like now in the dry season, because if you're in the Cole's Cave and the rain starts to fall, you might not be able to get back out, unless somebody who knows how to get in there can get you out. Vetchman Hall Gully, Walt Spring, Pori Spring, these are areas that can be developed and as attractions, but you have to be able to get to these areas. A lot of the bars and shops in Barbados are now becoming more sophisticated. You ain't getting a bread and two now, sir, in a rum shop in Barbados. You're getting meals that you would get street food, as you call it in other places. How do you get to these locations? Are you going to issue a minibus permit to get to Pori Spring? That one bus? But that is not going to create any reliability that a passenger would plan their business to wait on B155 that go in Pori Spring to get to a particular shop. It cannot work that way in the modern world. So that we need to be able to locate these places and connect them with the traveling public if we're talking about creating entrepreneurial activity, not only for the operators of these vehicles, but for the places where sites and services can be accessed by Barbadians and visitors. Transport is a public utility service that is required by everyone. And we need to cut out the issue of route allocation, which to my mind severely limits the ability of the operators to make a proper return on their investment, given the high cost of insurance, diesel, license fees, and so forth, wages that they have to pay. And then again, the whole issue of how the workers and operators in the sector are paid. You segregate that whole community, owners take a particular take, and then it's up to how they hustle on the road. These things can be eliminated once we start to treat with the sector in a way as the delivery of a public utility service. So I commend the efforts of government to deal with the indiscipline on the roads, to deal with the issues that we have in terms of making sure that the sector is well regulated and well organized. These are important first steps, in my view, to honing in a sector that has been on the loose for too long. Sir, I want to close my contribution by suggesting to the Transport Authority that it looks in the future to create a proper appellate system, particularly as it relates to the suspension of licenses of the operators and the owners, so as not to clog up the court system with court cases where somebody feels an reasonable administrative decision has been taken to revoke a permit or to suspend a permit that had been issued. Once Parliament gives powers to public authorities and they have the ability to administer these powers, we need to recognize that these powers are not unfettered. The law of reasonableness and propriety, procedural fairness, are things that undo proper decisions all of the time. We might want to arrest a particular problem, but we might not have given the person a hearing or an opportunity to state their case. And that undermines the very decision that you have made. And it will cost the taxpayers thousands of dollars in court costs and damages. Not because you came to the wrong decision, but you elected a process that was not fair to the person being affected. These things should not end up in a court, sir. I believe the Transport Authority should be imbued with the powers to have its own appellate system to determine these issues. Whether you need to have an independent panel to look at the decision of the authority and to review it on its merits and give a final decision. Because if we don't do that, these things will lock down the court system. And once you leave that avenue open, a lot of mistakes will be made and a lot of unworthy licensees and operators who should not be on the road might be able to exploit that system and still remain on the roads. And then you know what happens? They look at you and laugh and say, "You can't touch me." The powers, therefore, of the Transport Authority, to my mind, have to be circumscribed by a regulatory framework that allows fairness in how the decisions to suspend, cancel, and revoke licenses and permits is done. If not, that system, if not properly implemented, will undermine the very spirit and ethos for which these rules are created. Sir, with those few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Any other speakers? Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shan't be long, but I think I take the opportunity to look at transportation in a little wider form. We've extensively talked about the problems with PSVs and those types of vehicles. But there's another problem on the road, which I think I haven't heard anyone refer to here yet, and I think I'll take the opportunity to do so, which is, in my mind, the size of vehicles that we bring into this country. I had the opportunity to travel to Japan. One of the first things that I noticed is that everything there is built to size. And we continue to talk about the roads in Barbados being small. Roads in Japan were no bigger than the roads in Barbados. But the vehicles that were on the road fit the size of the roads that were being used. Here in Barbados, we can have huge trucks, Mack trucks and all kinds of things coming out of the USA. And Mr. President, anybody who drives on the roads here knows it's not easy. When you have to deal with them, or you're dealing with the ones that have the containers on them, or you have the trucks that are moving goods to other places, and the kind of behavior exhibited by those drivers also. And I believe that the time has come where this mass transit authority that we're looking to go to must begin to look at this particular problem, because our roads are small. And the 166 square miles where there's no real expansion of what people say straight roads. You can butt up on corners every 5 minutes. And if you're not careful, especially during the period like now where the crop is, and you've got big long trailers and things on the road, driving at ridiculous speeds. Ridiculous speeds. It is only by the grace of God that we have not had major accidents on our roads with these types of vehicles. And so I believe that the time has come where we must look at that particular aspect. And I also want to pick up from where Senator Nichols was going. We have spoken about creating what I would call a nighttime economy. And I believe that if we're going to that type of a status, that there are a number of vehicles that should really do their movements between 6 in the afternoon and 6 the following morning. And after that, you do not see them on the road at all. So the traffic, especially on when people are trying to get to work, and you have huge trucks, for instance, especially the ones in construction, that might be moving another vehicle to a place where they have to begin to dig up the road or create something else. You have long waits because these things can't get around particular corners, or they're extremely slow on the highways. These are things that we have to begin to think about. And then I've often said, how can you have what we have inherited? Wonderful sea. And it plays no part in the transportation of people. None whatsoever. And I believe that we should, again, these are things you're going to have to look at. How you're going to regulate it, how you're going to have water taxis, and these type of things to ease the congestion on the streets, to move people probably from Spikestown to Oistins, where people like myself living in the east in St. Philip or whatever may be able, as you said earlier, to park my car in Oistins and get onto a water taxi and go to town, or go all the way up to Spikestown and come back. So these are just a few things that I would like us to begin to think about as we go forward. And I think Senator Nichols also mentioned the idea of, and I don't want to be wrong, but please correct me if I am, of abolishing rules, so to speak, for persons. I, on the other hand, look at it the other way. If you go to Trinidad, in particular, for any of us who've been involved in Carnival and these kind of things, I can get into a car that would take me from Port of Spain to San Fernando. And I suggest that in Barbados, that sort of arrangement is not impossible. If you have specific cross-country routes where you know you're moving people for work, and it can also cut out the need for persons to have to get up at a particular time to get 2 buses to get to one spot. So these are just a couple of things I think may be able to help as we look to control or manage better the problem of transportation in Barbados. But I also want us to think of it wider than just the minibuses, but what else can we add to make movement across this island better and safer. And so with those few words, I'm blessed you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Any other speakers? Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wanted to first thank all of the honourable members who have spoken. In my initial comments, Mr. President, I did speak about how well ventilated this issue was in the public space. We all have extensive opinions on what we see on our roads, what we aspire to see on our roads, what we are abhorred by on our roads, and what we would aspire to be able to evolve into a policy framework that leads Barbados into having a transformed public service sector. Let me begin first by responding to some of the specifics. I know that the honourable member who joined us late was not here when we went through the why of this amendment and what we were hoping to be able to do, Mr. President. And so I want to just take a brief moment to go through the why for his benefit, and for anyone who, for example, may not have heard the initial why, Mr. President. We have in the current existing legislation an anomaly, as I mentioned, where the entity that is the licensing entity, namely the Barbados Licensing Authority, they issue the permit, and the Barbados Transportation Authority is supposed to be the entity that is responsible for regulating the sector, and so there is an anomaly that does not allow for the Transport Authority to enforce the regulations on how the roads are to be used by those to whom permits are issued by a separate entity, and this amendment means to address that. But I think I understood you, while asking the specifics of the amendment itself, to be asking a broader question as well. So while we are treating to the issues of what is happening specifically in the PSB sector and the entities responsible for issuing and regulating the sector in those 2 agencies, it is absolutely a much broader societal issue. And also, before you joined, I did speak extensively, Mr. President, as you would recall, on not just how the PSB sector is functioning and the hustle of the PSB sector and the need for there to be the business of public transportation in terms of models, minimum standards being set for what the revenue base needs to look like, so that you don't have people hustling to make that minimum threshold to take back to owners and then having to take the excess out of profits, resulting in a lot of the misbehavior we're seeing on the road. But I did also make a wider call, which is a more societal call, which is specific, Mr. President, as you would be aware, that everyone here has spoken. I believe the honourable member who just took his seat spoke about what happens with large vehicles, container trucks, the size of vehicles on the road, sometimes barreling through at top speed, small roads in some instances. I spoke also about the users of private vehicles like ours, those of us who drive private vehicles in here, treating to the road rules with very little regard and very little respect for other road users, simple things that are well ventilated and talked about in the public narrative that are attributed quite rightfully to some of the PSV drivers in particular, stopping in the middle of the road, failing to use indicators, failing to signal what they're intending to do, overtaking indiscriminately. All of those things we spoke about are equally applicable oftentimes and in an evolving way to private road users who are themselves oftentimes failing to pull over to the curb, stopping suddenly in the middle of the road. You see people on the highways, Mr. President, not even on secondary roads, stopping along the highway to buy coconut water in the middle of the thoroughfare without even attempting to pull over. That's the kind of indiscriminate behavior that we are seeing on our roads and is being mirrored also in the private sector vehicle community. We also heard, Mr. President, those who spoke about the responsibility of road users, who is behind these indiscriminate users of the road in the PSV sector. And Mr. President, in the same way that we were talking about those persons who may be waiting for the resources to come home to make a living, there are also those passengers, owners, and users of the public sector vehicles who are themselves often guilty of irresponsible conduct. How many times have we seen passengers waiting to be picked up by a PSV, not at a bus stop, and the bus stop is not far away from where they are actually standing? They are not far from a bus stop, but they have chosen because they know that the PSV is going to stop and the PSV is hustling, so he's going to stop anyway. But if they are waiting for a transport board vehicle, they will stand up at the bus stop in certain communities. So there is a responsibility also on those who are behind the hustle. Those are the persons who are there. Then you have the people who are walking down a side road comfortably, and they're not hustling, and they're waiting. They're going to see a van passing at the top of the road. They don't have to hustle to meet a certain time that the bus is coming down the road at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so they don't have to wait to get to the bus stop on that time. They know that if a van stops at the top of the road, somebody's dragging, they will spot them down the road, and so they're comfortable taking their time, not getting to the top of the road on time. We also know that there are the owners who are behind, who are in some instances not without influence in communities, who are themselves incentivized to encourage wrongdoing among the people who own them. We know all of those things, Mr. President, so this is a well-ventilated issue. And so in my initial presentation, I was very clear that this is, while a regulation specific and not complex, relating to the PSV sector, there is a broader societal question that has to be addressed in terms of how we as a people are treating to the functioning of our roads, efficiency of our public transportation system, and respect for others above all else. So those are some of the things that we raised effectively. Senator Paris and Senator Nichols spoke about the enforcement component in a lot of ways. In one instance about the inspectors, as was the case with Senator Paris, and then Senator Nichols, in an excellent contribution, spoke about the basis of jurisprudence that then helps to inform how we treat to this sector in cases that are being used in determining how we are approaching the management and the regulatory management of the sector. All important contributions, and I want to recognize all of them for what they are. And so, Mr. President, having ventilated all of these things, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill for the second reading of the bill a second time.
No, you have to move that the bill be read a second time.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further deliberation of the bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Honourable Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 2 do not stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour kindly say aye?
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 do not stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Transport Authority Amendment Act of 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Transport Authority Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is therefore now passed and so cited.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate is suspended for lunch until 2:45 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:45 p.m. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The sitting is therefore suspended until 2:45 p.m. today.